You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 19th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
The world is a worse place now. We have the biggest number of armed conflicts since the end of the Second World War.
Words of warning from Brazil's President Lula as his country hosts the G20 summit. We'll assess day one of a meeting of the world's most powerful leaders in very troubled times. Also coming up in the next 60 minutes, Russia turns off Austria's gas taps. We'll find out why and ask how come Austria's been able to get its energy from a country subject to sanctions. Plus... Georgia's election commissioner is doused in black paint after declaring victory for a pro-Moscow party in the country's elections. We'll have the latest as the European Union meets to discuss the situation. We'll go through the newspapers and hear the latest music news too. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. Two prominent Hong Kong pro-democracy leaders have been sentenced to up to 10 years in prison for subversion in a landmark trial under Hong Kong's harsh national security law. Ukraine marks 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion today. Estimated that hundreds of thousands of people have either died or been injured since the conflict began 33 months ago. And Germany and Finland say they are deeply concerned after an undersea telecoms cable connecting the two countries was severed. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, this week and last, Latin America will enjoy its moment in the sun. Last week's APEC summit showed Peru as a good host and good investment, especially to the Chinese. Well, this week, the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro takes centre stage for the G20, with the opportunity both to further it and the continent's profile, and also to act as facilitator for those crucial bilateral meetings. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, Professor in International Law and International Affairs at Birkbeck College. Welcome back, Oscar. Good to see you.
It's a pleasure being here.
Good morning to you. So let's start off with Brazil. Is it being a good host?
Well, just to take a cue from you, we all need a little bit of sun, particularly this time of the year. And Brazil is certainly using its role as host of the G20 to bring a bit of sunshine and hope into the world. The way it is doing so is by leading what would become the final declaration of the G20 around two themes, the war against hunger and poverty. If Brazil manages to posit those two as the goal for the leaders of the world, that would be important. We need every single bit of good news and good orientation in times like this.
It strikes me that Brazil is not being a good host. It's being a very principled host as well. It's pushing very hard on the likes of targeting the super rich, and it's not just those who you would ordinarily believe would be keen to make such a move, but they're getting the likes of France and other very, very wealthy nations involved in this.
That is incredibly interesting. Pretty much every big nation, but not just the states, also close to 80 organizations around the world, including some of the organizations that speak for millionaires and billionaires themselves, are behind this project to tax rich people more. It is recognized as an absolute necessity if we are going to tackle climate change, but also, as I said before, hunger and poverty. These are very basic, very basic ground lines. It is very important that Brazil is leading on this. There were some dissident voices to begin with, also in Latin America. We'll speak about that later on. But this particular line is gathering support from all over the world.
How is it doing it? How's Brazil doing it so well?
Well, Brazil has a very interesting tradition of very effective diplomacy, and that hasn't changed. In fact, it has, after the sort of gray and sad Bolsonaro period, it has returned. Brazil punches above its way, and the way it does so is by engaging in what Brazilian diplomats call in-person meetings. They are firm believers in the power of gatherings, meetings, speaking face-to-face and encounters, and that's precisely what we have seen both in the run-up to and during the G20 meeting.
So it all seems as if things are running smoothly. However, for the last couple of weeks, there have been some very loud rumblings from the Argentinian president, Javier Milei. Spectacular photographs of him from last week when he was at a face-to-face mansion dinner at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. I mean, it was an encounter of two, you could only describe it as like-minded souls. Mm-hmm. This is a huge challenge for the G20 and also for Latin America at this point, at this juncture, isn't it?
Absolutely the case. Back in 2010, you might remember I wrote a book called What If Latin America Ruled the World? And that had both, good things about it, but also bad things. And the latter has turned out to be true. It is well known in Latin America that Trump gets inspiration from Latin American strongmen, the likes of Rios Montt or Álvaro Uribe Vélez. And Javier Milei proves the case once more. In fact, to many analysts, the way to begin to predict perhaps what a Trump administration would look like is to look into the Argentinian mirror. Trump himself told Javier Milei during that encounter at Mar-a-Lago in Florida that he would like to copy his model. If that is the case, then some very interesting things happen. On the one hand, of course, these are two very different economies. But you can see that on certain macroeconomic indicators, such as inflation, Milei is already claiming a victory. And yet, those macroeconomic indicators, which are there for the big financiers, mask a heavy toll. Poverty has shot up in Argentina. Inflation is still, on an annual basis, over 190%. And to bring the point back home, when it comes to the G20, Milei was the lonely voice trying to on the one hand, saying that he would not sign this alliance against hunger and poverty because that crossed certain red lines. The Milei government is against the UN 2030 and the G20 2030 agenda. And yet, very interestingly, just yesterday, Milei had to concede. Full U-turn. And this is, in fact, the second one, because Milei also had to concede on relations with the next big protagonist of the G20, which is Xi Jinping. China in Latin America is becoming a force to be reckoned with. Xi Jinping inaugurated the Chancay megaport in Peru last week, which will allow China to pretty much circumvent any passage through North American seas over the Pacific in order to trade. China is already the biggest trading partner of Brazil, for instance, but also of Argentina. And listeners might recall that Milei had promised to cut ties with that communist country, as he put it. Well, he has recanted already. You might call that pragmatism, Others call it, well, this is the force of reality. So to answer your question, Latin America as a whole has already an alternative and has been moving towards that alternative. That is to say, an intertwinement with China, a closer alliance for a while. It is likely that as Trump tariffs and threats happen, Latin America will move further closer to China.
What can we see Trump trying to expect to do to this? I mean, you talked about the fact that Trump takes inspiration from the strongmen leaders of Latin America. But if you do have the likes of, if you do see Latin America actually pulling together and moving further towards China, what could Trump possibly do? I mean, would he be interested in wooing Latin America back? Or do we just see a continuation of everything being transactional and everything not necessarily being that strategic?
To me, it's clear that Trump is going to try to use Argentina as a wedge to divide Latin America. That is the way in which the United States has traditionally behaved towards the southern part of the Western Hemisphere, dividing and conquering, as they would say. That will prove to be more difficult this time for various reasons. On the one hand, because Trump needs, for instance, oil prices to remain low in the United States, which I believe will mean less hostility towards certain regimes such as Venezuela. And in the case of Mexico, for instance, which would feel the pain of these threats first and hardest, well, these two economies are so intertwined now that it would cut both ways. If Trump were to raise tariffs on Mexican products, Mexico has favorable trade terms. It exports more to the U.S. than it imports. Then that kind of measure would hit the American economy just as well.
And briefly, apologies to interrupt, but would then Mexico find itself turning further towards Latin America?
Precisely, that would be the other possibility. If Trump does, come true with these threats, it is very likely that Mexico would begin to turn further towards China, following the example of Brazil. Brazil has been very clever, some might say, in moving in that direction, which is to say, to open up the space of possibilities so as to have room for maneuver. Things might be a bit more difficult for Cuba. We know Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, has, of course, a personal thing about Cuba. But in fact, Cuba is not really news within political circles in U.S. Quite a Freudian slip there. And ditto for other countries such as Colombia. The U.S. needs a good relationship with Colombia, even with its current leftist government, in order to stop immigration, for instance.
Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, thank you so much as ever for joining us in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist. It's 8:13 in Vienna, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, this week we'll see parts of Austria experience their first real taste of biting winter, with daytime temperatures in the likes of Vienna rising to no higher than 3 Celsius during the daytime. It's likely, therefore, that many will reach for the thermostat and turn up the heating. Well, Russia, well versed in the art of cold weather politics, knows this. And it is in this context that Moscow's state-owned national gas company, Gazprom, turned off the supply to Austria this weekend. It follows a decision by the Austrian utility firm OMV to stop paying for its gas. And to tell us more and explain why, I'm joined now by Alexei Koryolov, who's Monocle's Vienna correspondent. A very good morning to you, Alexei.
Morning, Emma.
Just explain what's happened, could you please?
Well, yes. So, this story goes back several years. Obviously, before Russia started its invasion of Ukraine, Gazprom was the chief supplier of gas to Europe. And to Austria as well. But then again, this is something really interesting. Throughout this war, Russian gas has been flowing through Ukraine, and indeed is still flowing. So Ukraine still transits Russian gas to Central Europe. But then Ukraine said in recent months, we want to end this relationship at the end of this year. And that obviously threatens supplies. And Austria is on the receiving end of this. And Austria itself has a gas contract with Russia going, I think, until 2040, exactly, with Gazprom. So it was sort of locked into that contract. But then when Ukraine said, we're going to stop transiting Russian gas, that was obviously worrying for Austria and for other Central European countries. And then last week, Austria won an arbitration case against Gazprom, awarding it 230 million euros in compensation and damages over some deliveries via Germany in 2022 when the war began. And so sort of Gazprom took umbrage at that, and then they said, we're gonna stop supplies, gas supplies to Austria, and indeed they did. On Saturday, they officially stopped gas flowing to Austria. Although there have been media reports since then that Russian gas continues reaching Austria and continues reaching Central Europe.
Which is an interesting point, given the fact that Russia is very good at knowing when to turn the taps on and off, depending on where it wants to exert its authority. But what's been the effect in Austria? Have you noticed, or has there been any kind of change in the supply of energy, or what have the Austrian authorities said in terms of how they're going to keep homes warm?
Well, I'm one of those who have reached for the thermostat because, indeed, temperatures have plummeted here in Vienna. But Austrian authorities, immediately when sort of the news broke on Friday evening, the Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer and other officials, they've said, we're prepared for this. We've been preparing for this for years. We've secured alternative supplies. There's liquefied gas from Germany and Italy. There's gas from Norway. Austria has its own gas reserves, very meager, but still. So, they say our gas reserves are over 90% full, almost 100% full. So, we're well prepared for the winter ahead and for the next 2 winters. So in that sense, there hasn't been any sort of immediate effect on prices, gas prices, heating prices here in Austria. But obviously, that's a worrying sign. It's not really clear what's going to happen because, as I said, Austria does have this contract with Gazprom until 2040. So what's going to happen to that legally, that remains to be seen.
That contract is not just a legal one. It seems to be symptomatic of the bigger and more complicated relationship that Austria has with Russia. We know there were reports earlier on this year that Vienna has now become Russia's sort of hotbed of spying, and accusations that espionage was rife within various Austrian government. Russian spies were rife among various Austrian government departments. But there's also that deeper financial connection, the banking world. What is it about Austria that ties it still so closely to Russia in a way that other nations have managed to sever connections given Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, that is a very good question, Neil. Well, it's sort of funny that Europe's dependence on Russian gas actually began in Austria. It was in 1968 that Soviet gas at the time started flowing into Europe, and it was through Austria. So it's sort of interesting, and it was during another invasion. That summer, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, Prague. And now this is sort of coming to an end during another invasion. But yeah, I mean, Austria does have these very deep historical ties to Russia because of its sort of neutral status. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union was one of the guarantors of Austria's sort of security. And because of that, Austria was always seen by Moscow as a sort of safe trading partner. And, therefore you have all these long-standing banking, financial, energy links going back decades, which is, now it's all sort of crumbling because Austria Austria has its own political troubles, and Russia features very prominently in them. Obviously, many politicians here feel that now it's time to sort of to say definitively to Russia, it's either this way or that way. We're not going to trade with you anymore. We're not going to do this anymore until you change your ways. Nehammer, the Austrian chancellor, was the first Western leader to travel to Russia after the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Austria does still sort of see itself as a sort of a neutral arbiter between Europe and Russia. But, we're getting the feeling that relationship is coming to an end.
Indeed. And when you mentioned there the fact that some gas is still managed to indirectly get from Russia to Austria still, what does that say about the wider problems that Europe has in terms of imposing sanctions, cutting ties with Russia when there are still ways of circumventing things?
Well, yes, indeed. It is symptomatic of Europe's sort of wider entanglement with Russia. And, the trouble with gas is that gas is not sort of, you can't know for sure all the time where it comes from. So, there's a way for gas and energy in general to, it's unmarked, it's unlabeled in a sense. So, you can't know for sure all the time where it comes from. But yeah, indeed, I mean, since the beginning of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, even before the war, Europe has been pushing for more diversification, for looking for alternative supplies. As I say, gas from Norway, liquefied gas from Germany and Italy. So all of that is happening. And, Austria is actually lagging behind. So Austria was one of the last countries depending heavily on Russian gas. But, as we're seeing now, it's coming to an end. But what we see in general is that Europe has done actually a pretty good job of sort of moving away from Russian energy. Austria may be one of the last major players to exit that. I mean, there's still Hungary and Slovakia who are still buying Russian gas, and nothing has happened to official Russian supplies to them. But that may change as well.
Alexei Korylov in Vienna, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's Globalist. Messy times in Georgia's politics as paint is thrown over the election commissioner. We'll find out why later. Stay with us.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:22 here in London. Let's continue now with a look at today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Claudine Fry, partner at Control Risks. Good morning, Claudine.
Good morning, Emma.
How's life?
Good, thank you. How about you?
Very good, thank you very much indeed. A moment ago we were talking about Russia's gas supplies to Austria still being cut off and the murky world of connectivity. This is going to be a theme that you want to talk about in today's newspaper review, isn't it?
Yes, it's hard to avoid. One of the stories I've picked is from the Financial Times, telling us about Germany and Finland yesterday issuing a statement of deep concern about the severance of undersea communications cables between their two countries. Not actually attributing blame to any particular country or source, but nonetheless issuing a statement that makes it very clear they're linking the severance of the cables to geopolitical turbulence. And I think we all are aware that the suspicion is that Russia is probably involved either directly or indirectly.
So this is a big fibre optic cable that runs between Helsinki in Finland and Rostock in Germany. And it's a crucial it's a crucial bit of kit, isn't it?
That's right. We don't really think about these undersea cables a huge amount, but actually they are absolutely essential to our ability to be, particularly on the internet, for example. In actual fact, this cable severance did not damage internet connectivity in either country, but it is not the first such incident to have occurred. In fact, there was another one over the weekend between Sweden and
I think it was Lithuania.
Lithuania, that's right. And there is a growing concern, as the piece notes, and certainly in my role as a geopolitical risk analyst, I can confirm that many organisations are increasingly concerned about industrial sabotage. You might remember before the Olympics started in France in the summer, there were all those strange sort of explosions on the French railway system. That was another example of these sorts of low-level industrial sabotage incidents, which are being linked in some way potentially back to Russia.
If you talk there is surely a slight difference in scale here. To plant booby traps on railway lines is difficult but possible. To sabotage not one but two cables in the space of 4 or 5 days, deep cables in very, very cold parts of the world, that requires a much higher level of engagement and intelligence and knowledge here, doesn't it?
That's right. That is one of the reasons that there is so much suspicion around who might be responsible. It's not the kind of thing that happens by chance or accident very easily.
And what do you talk to? I mean, not to give too much away, but when you talk to your clients, I mean, you say that they're really worried about industrial sabotage.
Yeah, that's right. It's one of those indirect consequences of the situation in Ukraine and its potential escalation, which companies are really worried about because it can be hard to attribute blame. And it makes it very difficult to anticipate what's going to come next. But it's certainly one of the ways in which geopolitical actors are now seeking to weaken their adversaries.
Right, let's move to a story based in the United Kingdom in The Guardian today. It's carried out a study to talk about poverty levels, and it is reported that almost a quarter of people living, 1 in 4 people living in the United Kingdom live in poverty, and 1 in 3 children live in poverty.
Yeah, these statistics are really, really astonishing. Here in the UK, obviously one of the richest countries in the world, and we still have an extraordinary amount of people living in poverty. And not only that, the amount of people living in poverty actually has increased dramatically, particularly since COVID. The report notes a number of different categories of people which are increasingly living in poverty, including children, but also actually people who are disabled in some way. And there's a lot of comment in the UK at the moment about the capacity of the government to stimulate economic growth. And clearly we have a huge problem with the very poorest people in society struggling to get out of living in very, very difficult circumstances. And clearly this is a developed economy, but actually this is a global story. Poverty everywhere has been not falling since about 2015. There was a massive fall in the amount of poverty globally between 2000 and about 2015. And then since then it has stagnated, and COVID pushed people around the world into more extreme levels of deprivation. So this is an issue across the world, but clearly even in emerged as well as emerging environments.
And where does the help come from? Because we have regular changes in government in different countries all around the world, especially in 2024. And the issue of poverty does not go away. We're looking at the G20. They're trying to sign agreements on anti-poverty drives. But where does that help actually come from? Because in many cases, people look to the state, but states are as cash-strapped as anywhere else.
That's right. And there's so much pressure on states. You know, we've just been talking about Ukraine and the geopolitical environments. And of course, there's pressure on states as well, particularly here in Europe, to be increasing defence spending, which also is a distraction away from addressing issues such as poverty at home. And I think this issue is going to, it's very difficult to imagine where the money comes from. But it's one of the reasons that we're all concerned about the growing polarisation within the political environment in Europe. and people just simply sort of opting out of mainstream politics and potentially being pushed towards more extreme ends of the political spectrum. So I think it's a very serious concern for us all.
And in your role as a risk analyst, when you're advising other nations, well, not advising nations, but advising people about the prospects of countries and places, how much does poverty actually factor into the sort of the whether a country or whether a nation is a safe bet or not?
Very little, actually, and not as much as it should. But I tell you what is coming up increasingly, and that's demographics. And this poverty story really feeds into that, because companies who are thinking very far out in the future are thinking about where are there going to be the skills that they need? Where are there going to be people who are paying taxes, essentially, and available for work and keeping the overall economy going. And so I think this poverty story is indirectly part of those questions that people are asking increasingly about demographics, but it's not at the forefront of minds.
Let's move to the Times of India and a story about pollution.
Oh, yes. Feeling very much for the people of South Asia, parts of South Asia, which have been absolutely sort of shrouded in smog over the past few days. It's not a new problem. Parts of India and Pakistan in particular have long been affected from time to time by very serious amounts of smog. But it is becoming a more intense problem. The levels of pollution are rising. And over the past few days, there have been very severe restrictions introduced, for example, in Delhi, where children are now doing their learning at home. People are working remotely instead of going into their offices or places of work. Trucks are banned from going into the city. Construction activities have been stopped. It is so horrific just walking around outside. And the Supreme Court yesterday, according to this Times of India piece, has criticised the Delhi government for being slow to enact measures, to enact these restrictions that are designed to keep people safe when the air outside is literally dangerous. And it has also instructed the state government to respect the court and asserted the court's right to decide when those restrictions will be reduced. And it's also reminded everyone that everyone has a right to live in a pollution-free environment, asserting that that's a fundamental right under the Indian constitution. So that's going to be putting a bit more pressure on the authorities at multiple levels within India to be doing a better job.
Finally, a story about a gold watch which is sold for an awful lot of money, which is interesting enough in itself. But the story behind it and the story of the ship involved, or rather the ships, plural, is remarkable. Isn't it? It's just such a captivating story, the Titanic, isn't it? This is a piece from the New York Times about the auction of a Tiffany pocket watch that probably sold for about $20 to $30 when it was gifted to the captain of a ship who rescued many survivors of the Titanic. It was gifted to him by 3 women who survived the Titanic disaster. And it was sold for nearly $2 million, astonishingly. Even more so as the watch doesn't actually work anymore. There is a hand missing, the auctioneer tells us. But he also notes that this story is still fascinating for an enormously wide number of people. He talks about people aged 18 to 80 who are still interested in what happened to the Titanic. And yes, this captain in particular who was gifted the watch was the captain of RMS Carpathia, which rescued the scene of the Titanic sinking. It arrived too late. The ship was already underwater, but it did nonetheless rescue many, many hundreds of people who were floating around and in rescue boats. And it's a particularly distinctive story. He's particularly heroic because there was another ship in the vicinity of the sinking Titanic which actually did nothing at all to help. Claudine Fry, thank you as ever for joining us in the studio. The time here in London is 7:33 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at the other stories we're keeping an eye on today. 2 prominent Hong Kong pro-democracy leaders have been sentenced to up to 10 years in prison for subversion in a landmark trial under Hong Kong's harsh national security law. Benny Tai and Joshua Wong were jailed for 10 and 4 years respectively for being part of the so-called Hong Kong 47 group. It involved a plan to pick opposition candidates for local elections. An Israeli airstrike has killed 5 people in central Beirut. It's the second day in a row that Israel has hit a target within the Lebanese capital as it presses its campaign against the militia group Hezbollah. Ukraine marks 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion today. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people have either died or been injured since the conflict began 33 months ago. And Germany and Finland say they're deeply concerned after an undersea telecoms cable connecting the two countries was severed. The two countries' foreign ministers said our European security is not only under threat from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, but also from hybrid warfare by malicious actors. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. There have been violent protests in Israel after 7,000 members of the Jewish ultra-Orthodox community were called up to the military. It's a second attempt to impose conscription on a community which, since the birth of Israel itself, has been granted a blanket exemption. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now in the studio by Yossi Meckelberg, Professor of International Relations at the University of Roehampton and a columnist at Arab News and a regular voice around the table here on Monocle Radio. Good to see you, Yossi. Good morning.
Good morning.
Just explain to us why the ultra-Orthodox community objects so strongly to conscription and why it has not been part of conscription.
So we can look at it different ways. Because they can. And, to serving in the military for men 3 years, for women 2 years, that's a long time. It's a stretch of service. And that's one of the perks their politicians actually managed to get to them. The other thing, their leaders are also afraid if they go to the military, they lose some of their religions. They will get involved more and more with secular, so they might leave religion. So they see it as their mission to keep the ultra-Orthodox, studying rabbinical seminars. Now, it goes back to the very early days of the State of Israel, when Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion thought, there are a few hundreds of them. Let's exempt them. It's a Jewish state.
Tiny number, wasn't it?
Yeah, we're talking now 60,000 compared to 400 then. So we'll exempt them. It's a Jewish state, so we need some people to keep the flame of Judaism. And it's spiraled out of control into tens and tens of thousands that don't serve in the army. And their political leaders sees them as one, and their rabbis as almost a tool of controlling them.
So it's religious principles to start off with, and yet it has become obviously a very, very difficult issue given the fact that Israel is waging military operations on several fronts. How much, on a practical level, does the Israeli military need conscription from the ultra-Orthodox community?
Yeah. It always needed more soldiers, but even more so since the war started more than a year ago. Israel lost already close to 800 soldiers in the war, many thousand injured, many soldiers with PTSDs, and the burden on the reserve. Israeli military is based on reserve service. Most of the soldiers fighting right now in different fronts are reserve. So they are doing up to 300 days over the last year, reserve service. Bringing in the ultra-Orthodox will ease the burden of serving, which has impact. Those are reservists that study at universities, working in different businesses. They have their own businesses, and they are collapsing. It affects family life in Israel. So this will mobilizing 18 to 21 years old from the ultra-Orthodox. It won't happen immediately, but it's towards easing this stress on so many hundreds of thousands in Israel.
And finally, we've seen, as I mentioned a moment ago, we've seen violent protests in the street against this conscription. But we've also seen great deep division inside the right-wing government, aren't we? We've just had the Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid saying that funding and passport should be denied to any ultra-Orthodox Jews who refuse to agree to conscription. Yeah,
this is one of Yair Lapid's main kind of issue to mobilize ultra-Orthodox, because it's fair in Israeli society, especially at time of war. But there is a bigger picture. It's not only the military service. It's also they're involved in society, not living aside of society. It's also their role within the economy. Many of them don't work. For instance, only 55% of ultra-Orthodox men are in the labor market compared to 87% of non-Orthodox. So it's the entire package of their involvement and integration within the Israeli society.
Yossi Meckelberg, thank you so much for joining me on Monocle Radio. It's 11:39 in Tbilisi, 8:39 if you're listening in Zurich. Now, this weekend, Georgia's election commission announced that the Georgian Dream Party was the winner of last month's vote, winning around 53% of the vote. Georgian Dream has gained a reputation for being increasingly authoritarian and for tilting towards Moscow. Observers had raised serious concerns over the way the election was run, and just after he had announced the results, the commissioner himself was doused in black paint by a protester. Well, yesterday, the European Union's foreign ministers met to discuss the result and what to do next. To explain everything, I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Marion Messmer, who's Senior Research Fellow in International Security at Chatham House here in London. Very good morning to you, Marion. Very good to have you with us.
Good morning.
Just explain to us what happened in the election that caused such consternation, objections, alarm bells raised by lots of people, and also a pot of black paint being thrown over the election commission.
Yeah, I mean, the Georgian elections were incredibly contentious because there was a lot of worry about the extent to which they might have been falsified, the role that disinformation played in the campaign, and they actually took place at this point several months ago, right? So arriving at this final result took quite a long time. So I think when looking at Georgia, it's really important to also see that in the larger context of the worry about the influence that Russia has had and what that essentially might mean for the wider region and other worries that we might have in Europe.
And Georgian Dream was symptomatic, one of the key elements of this worry, isn't it?
That's right, yes. I mean, that party rose to power, hoping to shift the relationship with Russia, but over time has also disappointed some Georgians by being seemingly too close to the Kremlin, and there being worries about the level of influence there.
The difficulty faced, though, is that there is very little that can be done by the outside world. I mean, let's talk about Georgia's relationship with the European Union. It applied for membership in March 2022, didn't it? And it was granted candidate status in 23. But things changed in June, didn't they?
Well, so I think Georgia's relationship with Western Europe has been on and off for years. I think if we just look at the attempt to become an EU member, then we're missing part of the context in a way, because this started almost a decade earlier, I think, at the time when Georgia was also hoping to apply for NATO membership, which then, of course, resulted in the Russian invasion of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2008. And so there has been this push and pull for a long time where the Georgian people really wanted to orient themselves much closer to Western Europe and become part of the European family in different ways. But at the same time, there has been this really contentious relationship with Russia. And so there have been these different push and pull factors on Georgia, and that has expressed itself in different ways. And so while there was a lot of support among some people in Georgia for the EU membership, that's also one of the things that Russia actually wasn't super happy with.
And it's an interesting problem for the European Union, because it has told Georgia that it must change political course before it will let Georgia back in the queue, because it sort of pushed it out pushed it off the path, didn't it?
Well, yeah, and I think that's really interesting because we see some of the struggles that the European Union has had with existing member states, that maybe were more democratic at one point and then have changed a lot. And there have been a lot of calls for European reforms just because the EU itself has become a little unwieldy, and it's possible for member states to block quite a lot of decision making. So in a sense, this was unprecedented for the European Union because it was an attempt to head off at the pass another potential member state that might become a problem once it is in the EU. But it's not necessarily something we've seen before. And I think it's part of the EU trying to figure out what to do about the fact that it is a union of lots of different member states with very different domestic situations.
Can you see Georgia pivoting on a more permanent basis towards Moscow, given what's happened in the last few weeks and months? I mean, if you look at what Georgian Dream does, I mean, there's been a crackdown of freedom of speech, there's been a crackdown on human rights. These are problems which are not easily unpicked.
Yeah, I mean, So there is a lot of popular support in Georgia still for more of a European orientation, and especially among younger voters and younger people, that's really strong. You know, they see opportunities lying more in the West, and they really want to distance themselves from Georgia's past. So I hope that this means that Georgia won't always have this tie to Russia, but of course. The Georgian Dream Party also chose this direction in part because they were hoping that it would make the country safer at a time when we actually see Russia acting really aggressively.
Marion Mesmer, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
.45 here in London. It's time now to talk music with Will Hodgkinson, the Times rock and pop critic. Good morning, Will. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine, thank you.
Good. Glad to hear it. Talk to me about Oasis if you absolutely have to.
Well, Oasis, do they have a new album or don't they? Liam Gallagher appeared to have let the cat out of the bag by saying that it's sounding great, we've been recording it, been sending my vocals in remotely. And then all of a sudden there's big denials. No, there is no Oasis new album. Why are you even asking? How dare you? I think it's called a slap on the wrists. So, you know, I think what's actually happening is that probably Noel Gallagher has been recording some material, seeing if it works, and that's as far as it's got. And of course, you know, this is all the entire thing could fall apart at any minute. So the sort of tight-lipped security around it is the only person leaking all this stuff is Liam Gallagher himself.
I mean, the potential for catastrophe with Oasis is actually 100% part of the fun. And one must ask the question, when was the last time anybody took what Liam Gallagher said massively seriously? He quite likes to stir things up and then tells us to go back to as we were.
He does, but then the problem is that he does also tend, because he can't control himself, he tends to leak things, you know, that are real at the same time. So the reunion has been mooted for years and years and years, and it finally happened through lots of, you know, late night phone calls and negotiations. And of course, Liam was the one who leaked it, you know, before the official announcement. So it's kind of, I think, you know, he says these things, but it doesn't mean they're not happening.
Just tell us, Will, what a middle-aged Oasis album could sound like, because when you got the chaos and the rage and the brilliance of Definitely Maybe, when they exploded onto the scene, recording it in chaos and pandemonium, there was a really, really incredibly unique sense, which is arguably what gave Oasis its sound. They're a little bit older and wiser now, aren't they?
Well, you're completely right. If you look at their history, Definitely Maybe was this incredible burst of ambition and chutzpah and, you know, and this kind of, it's a very much working class hedonism. The idea, well, it doesn't matter if it fails because we've got nothing to lose. By What's the Story, Noel Gallagher had realised he was a very good songwriter and he could make anthems that got out to the world, not just, you know, sort of indie music fans. Then, of course, it was diminishing returns. There were good songs on the later Oasis albums, but they didn't have that same drive because they weren't feeling what everyone else was feeling. They were millionaires. You know, Liam Gallagher went from his mother's house in Burnage to Patsy Kensit's house in Primrose Hill with nothing in between. So he didn't really grow up. I don't know what it could sound like. What I hope is that it could be a little bit more reflective. Noel loves people like Neil Young. He loves Bob Dylan. If he could take their lead and do something which is actually suitable for middle age, because you can't pretend to be 19 anymore.
I do like the idea of Noel Gallagher writing something suitable for middle age.
I know, it's hard to imagine, but the fans will be middle aged, I can guarantee you.
And Liam Gallagher trying to sing it as well. I mean, there is that sort of age now, isn't there, that live music is coming back for people of around 50 years old. It's a very strange experience.
It will be. I mean, the thing is, the Oasis ticket debacle was huge, you know, because of the dynamic pricing. It meant they're incredibly expensive. And, you know, it was a mess. The thing about Oasis is that they're very appealing to a younger generation. You know, my teenage daughter likes Oasis because they're fun. They're really good fun. And they seem very unfettered, which is not typical of the modern age. They don't seem PR'd. So there is an appeal there. And I think obviously it's huge news, but there's a financial reality of who can buy the tickets.
Just apropos of what your teenage daughter listens to, is there an equivalent of an Oasis going around at the moment which has that element of fun?
I mean, the equivalent is completely and utterly different, and that's Charlie XCX, because she's equally irreverent and very British in that way. It's not typically American, but of course that's a pure pop world. So I think she's probably the most similar in that very sort of British, rather hedonistic, rather cheeky attitude that the best pop stars have always had.
Thank you for that piece of advice. Let's talk about another time-travelling episode in the world of music. Live Aid Band-Aid, that's being revisited and not everybody's happy about it.
Well, this is interesting. You know, Band-Aid has been revisited over the years, and it's always been one of these things that pop stars do to make them feel good about themselves. They feel that they're not just making a lot of money, they're saving the world too. And Ed Sheeran, of all people, who's really, as commercial as it gets, has spoken out. He says that he's been listening to criticisms by the Ghanaian singer Fuse ODG on the colonial nature of Band-Aid and the fact that when he was growing up, Fuse ODG, this is, growing up in Africa, all he saw was this idea of the West coming in and sweeping down and saving the day from poverty and crisis. And he felt that it stifled economic growth. It certainly stifled tourism. It stifled the idea of true independence. So it's an interesting statement that Ed Sheeran said, I don't want to be a part of it. And he wanted his vocals taken off because the current 2024 version is fusing all the different versions. And so there's everyone from, One Direction to Duran Duran. They're all on there. And he's the only person who said he wanted to take it off. Bob Geldof responded very, very crossly, saying that, this little song has saved hundreds, if not thousands of millions of people. You kept them alive, which may or may not be true. I mean, I think the intentions are there and theoretically the practical benefits are there too. But I understand Fuse ODG's point and Ed Sheeran's point, really. It's interesting.
Finally, bring us some music that we probably haven't heard before. Some Ukrainian 1970s music of resistance.
Well, this carries on being relevant. This was music which was recorded mostly in the Soviet era, and it was tightly controlled because all the recording studios were Soviet. Everything had to be passed through the censors. So what happened was that creative artists found ways to get through the censors in a sort of, with an element of subterfuge. And so this beautiful album, which has come out, is a compilation called Even the Forest Hums. It's on Light in the Attic Records, and it's from 1971 to 1996. There's a track by the Shapoval Sextet called Oh, Get Ready, Cossack, There Will Be a March. It sounds as Soviet as it gets, but the music is free jazz, which is completely, not what you expect. It's very interesting because by the end of the 80s and the early 90s, the writing was on the wall for the USSR, as we know. There was a surprise concert by Sonic Youth in Kiev in 1989, which is hugely influential. And then there a burst of post-punk bands who were making new sounds without fear of censorship. So then it became a symbol of Ukrainian pride, which has since become extremely important because of the relationship with Russia. So it's a very, very interesting album, and it's music that so far has not got beyond the country's borders.
Well, we have a tiny clip of something that you can just talk to us about. It's called Play the Violin Play by Kirilo Stetsenko, and it's on this compilation. Well, I'm just going to sign up for that immediately. That's absolutely that's a marvel.
Yes, Play the Violin Play. That was there's a pop star of the time called Tetiana Kocherina, and she was trying to reestablish herself in the 1980s, and so that's when that's from. And it had state musicians, and it was also their attempt at doing disco, even though it doesn't sound like disco in the normal sense. So it's an example of how it was combining aspects of the West, Ukrainian folk tunes, all these different things. And of course, there was a very limited knowledge of music that could come through. So there'd be tapes of disco and this kind of thing that would get through to Ukraine, which was obviously part of the USSR at the time. So, yes, that's an example of the cross-pollination that happened.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us on the programme. And Andrew Muller did a feature on that album on Monocle on Culture in September. Go to our website and find out more. Now, if you live in Lucerne, tour buses are a headache, so the authorities have decided to charge them for visiting and indeed parking. So I'm joined now from Basel by Bruno Kaufmann, journalist and the Swiss Broadcasting Company's global democracy correspondent, and for today's purpose, the tour bus correspondent. Good morning, Bruno.
Good morning, Emma.
So, what's Lucerne's problem with buses?
Yeah, I mean, Lucerne is really a tourist hotspot in Switzerland. I live there myself. I'm from Lucerne. So I really experienced how it is when you have like thousands and thousands of tourist coaches coming in. Lucerne has more day trippers than Venice has per inhabitant. So it's a small place with a lot of visitors, and the people haven't been happy with this for years. And since the pandemic, when people felt how we could change, the city government has developed an idea of limiting the coach buses into the city, which arrive. And now there is a new system at place, which will include the fee for stopping buses to enter and to leave the buses. And every bus needs to pay 100 Swiss francs if they want to do that.
If you have a tour bus full of people who want to go and enjoy a day out in Lucerne, is 100 francs really going to put you off?
It's not only these 100 francs which will make the difference. It's also the numbers of slots the city government will allow. So this will allow the city to really limit the numbers of buses and the number of people arriving and leaving. And the buses will need to park outside the city in the future. They cannot just leave it outside the train station, for example. So this will be a possibility, like you have with other like slots for cruise ships in Venice. The city government will be able to go up and down depending on the full number of people which wants to arrive.
Just explain to us how Switzerland is having to try to balance this more generally, because it is an industry. Tourism brings in about, 18 billion Swiss francs. It's a good, nice, healthy chunk of GDP. So keeping people, keeping the tourism industry well managed is absolutely vital for Switzerland, isn't it?
Absolutely. And Lucerne is the best example of that, because Lucerne has really taken in so much wealth and money from the tourists, but also, of course, have seen the backside. I mean, not only in Lucerne, in many other places today, the numbers of arriving tourists is so high and the infrastructure for this is not at place. I mean, in most places, the tourist buses come with the people go out, walk around, maybe do some shopping, use the restrooms, but this is not prepared for that. And restaurants, hotels, and the inhabitants have really suffered. So it will and is now Lucerne the first place to introduce such a system for buses. Lucerne already last year in a referendum decided to limit Airbnbs, which has also been a big problem for the rental market. So Lucerne is in a way Switzerland in a nutshell, and what's going on in Lucerne will, I guess, also be developed more around Switzerland in the future.
Bruno Kaufmann, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers, Hassan Anderson and Laura Kramer. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Lily Austin. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The Briefing is live at midday here in London, and The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.